Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell came out in opposition to Biden's $2.5 trillion infrastructure package, instead stating that his price limit is $600 billion. And of course, he absolutely refuses to raise taxes or unwind the GOP's 2017 tax cut.
So joining us now, Democratic strategist, owner of JC Strategies, Jennifer Holdsworth-Karp, Senior Director of Policy at the Conservative Partnership Institute, Rachel Bovard. They join us now to discuss. We left off on a cliffhanger. I was just about to ask Rachel about this because I find it really interesting, which is, Rachel, previous segment, we were talking a lot about changes within the Republican Party, and there are some limited. Largely, it's based on rhetoric. And yet, whenever we see it manifest itself in terms of policy, it consistently seems to come up on this side of the coin, which is McConnell drawing a $600 billion line, which I believe is basically the same thing that they proposed under the Trump administration when they nuked that infrastructure package. And then the same thing whenever it comes to going to the mat on corporate taxes, despite the fact that every 2024 presidential hopeful is like, actually, big business is bad now. So there doesn't seem to be any real choosing or breaking away outside of tweets and rhetoric. Or am I wrong?
Well, two things that are interesting to me about this statement. And the first is that McConnell's own members have sort of started signaling away from what McConnell is proposing. And as you point out, we're at the rhetoric stage of this debate, so I don't know how far down they'll take it. But you had Mike Braun from Indiana, who's a pretty conservative, libertarian-leaning senator, come out and say, hey, I do think corporations should pay more in taxes. Like, they don't seem to be paying their fair share. Lindsey Graham said the same. And then, Ted Cruz said the same and then walked it back and said we should have a flat tax. But, I do think there's not necessarily lockstep with McConnell on this point. But I think McConnell is always approaching it from, raw politics. Right. To him, this is about not giving Democrats a win before 2022. I honestly probably think the flip side is true for Chuck Schumer. He doesn't want to compromise with Republicans before 2022. But the break with big business with Republicans is the most interesting thing to me. If I were Chuck Schumer, I'd put these people in a box and make them vote on it.
Jen, what do you think of how Democrats have approached working with Republicans? It seems like they've spent some time, the Biden administration, trying to see if there's a bipartisan deal, specifically on the infrastructure piece that could be reached. I mean, this from McConnell basically means what was obvious from the start. Like, there is no deal that can be reached. It's an impossibility for these two sides to come together. You're going to have to do it through reconciliation. Do you think that they sort of get that?
They do. I think Democrats right now are more worried about negotiating with Joe Manchin than they are with Mitch McConnell. I think whatever Mitch McConnell says is nice. We will do what we want to do. We will come to an agreement, and then Vice President Kamala Harris will come down and vote on it. I just don't think that there's a scenario where we're going to indulge Mitch McConnell's obfuscation anymore. He comes with these pronouncements. The Republican Party does what they're going to do, and then they go out and they try to take credit for what the Democrats put together all over their Twitter. It's the same thing that's going to happen with this bill. And I agree. If I was Majority Leader Schumer, I would put them all in a box. I would make them vote on it. And I would then parade around the country saying they don't want to help you. They're in the pocket of big business. They don't care about the corporate tax loopholes. You're struggling on a day-to-day basis to put food on your table. We're still recovering from the pandemic. The economy is still coming back. The Republicans don't want to help you. They want to help Jeff Bezos. That should be the rallying cry for 2022.
Well, that's actually fascinating, given that Democrats seem to love Bezos more than anyone. But Rachel, let me ask you this, which is that whenever it comes down to it, is the original 2010 calculus, which this is all based on, which is that a vote for Obama is a political death knell for any Republican, is that still true? As in, if there was a Republican like Mike Braun or more that voted for a Biden infrastructure package, are they going to get crucified in the way that old politics would suggest, the way that some Republicans lost when they voted for Obamacare? Because I just think we live in a fundamentally different politics right now.
I honestly think it's issue based on infrastructure. I think there's a lot of room for Republicans to actually come across the aisle. But, it always goes back to what does the final package look like? If it's full of sort of climate justice, I think a lot of Republicans are going to be like, no. If it's actually full of roads and bridges, there are a lot of Republicans that desperately want to support this. But I think Jen is absolutely right in the sense that, they've made Republicans irrelevant to this debate because they're going to have a reconciliation package that will be able to include, I think, a lot of the taxes, some of the infrastructure, not any sort of new programmatic authority, but it will contain a lot of this. They don't need a single Republican for that as long as they have Manchin, as long as they have Kamala Harris. So they've made Republicans irrelevant to this debate. And when you do that, you don't give them a big incentive to partner with you.
Yeah, Jen, I wonder what you think of that, because it does seem to me while Republicans are basically voting and acting in the same way that they have for decades, they're kind of less unified in terms of the aggressive public rhetoric that they're able to mount. You know, we saw it first and foremost with the COVID relief bill. They didn't really bother to criticize it at all. They just kind of were like, well, it's really popular. We're not going to vote for it, but we'll just not say anything about it. They haven't mustered a great defense against the infrastructure bill either. And you know, under the Obama administration, they would have been all in on they're spending too much money and they're bankrupting our future generations, et cetera, et cetera. So do you feel like, at least rhetorically, there is a little bit of a difference in the Republican Party, and that they're kind of lost at sea in terms of how to handle these pieces that, some of which, look, Donald Trump famously, had infrastructure week every week. So how are you going to now aggressively be against it when for 4 years you were talking about similar things?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thrilled to death that the mainstream Republican Party as it exists now has given up the ghost in terms of deficit spending and the budget and we're spending ourselves into oblivion. That argument went straight out the door and off the bridge during the Donald Trump presidency. So now you have a Republican Party facing a wildly popular president who has attempted to reach across the aisle and has been turned away at each opportunity, continuing to do what he's going to do anyway, because as of right now, we technically have control of both houses. So we're going to do for the American people what we said we were going to do. Not to mention, not just is President Biden overwhelmingly popular, so are the policies and the spending that he is projecting right now. So the Republican Party is right now running against a popular president, a popular policy, and just trying to figure out how they can get away with taking credit for it with their constituents without pissing off Donald Trump in the interim.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. Thanks, guys. Really appreciate you joining us.
Thanks, ladies.
Next on Rising, Ben Burgess discusses his new book, Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, a critique of the contemporary left, when Rising returns.